Today, we'll be looking at the question of how can we align industrial development strategies with decarbonization pathways? In other words, how can we green the industry? Now, our session today will consist of 3 rounds of questions for the panel and 1 Mentimeter question for you, ladies and gentlemen, who are enjoying this stream from our virtual platform. Round 1, we'll take a look at industrial processes and the state of innovation for around 10 minutes. Then we'll discuss current regulatory frameworks and the role of policymakers. That will be followed by a round of questions from you, our audience. So be sure to take advantage of social media and, of course, that chat function right here in the virtual program. So now to our panel. I'll keep introductions here brief so that we have as much time as possible to talk. In this virtual platform for our speakers, timekeeping is of the essence, so please be sure to keep your responses to 2 minutes or under. Joining me today are Felipe BAYÓN, President and CEO of Ecopetrol, Alexandra, Manager for Public Affairs, Germany and Central Europe at CEMEX, Thiago, President of the Brazilian Energy Research Office, EPE, Markus, RAURAMO, CEO of Fortum, and Felix SEEBACH, the Energy and Climate Policy Head for BASF. Hello, welcome to you all, and thank you so much for joining me. I think what I'd like to do first is get us started off with a Mentimeter question, which you, our panelists, are of course welcome to answer, but also to our audience listening at home. This is a multiple choice question. It is the following. The level of environmental regulation currently in place for industry sectors such as oil and gas, construction, and chemical production is far too low, somewhat too low, just right, somewhat too high, or far too high. We'll take a look at those results a little bit later on, but for right now, I would like to get into our round of questions. Alexandra, I'll start with you, followed by Felix SEEBACH. Is the current rate of ambition and technological innovation in your industry sufficient to achieve net zero industry emissions by 2050? Ms. Decker? Hi, Ms. Decker, are you with us? I'd like to see if we could ask Mr. SEEBACH to answer that same question. Okay. Is the current rate of ambition and technological innovation in your industry sufficient to achieve net zero industry emissions by 2050?
So, Alexandra, please go ahead. I see you now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think the rate of ambition in the cement industry is high, and as well in my company. We have already committed to reach the worldwide climate neutrality in 2050 and also committed to the 55% reduction goal until 2030 in the EU, no doubt. Moreover, our end product concrete is an indispensable building material also to meet global challenges. In terms of technological innovations, the cement industry faces a great challenge. We have already invested in the avoidance of CO2 emissions by increasing the production efficiency in various ways. Also, the development of new products like low clinker cement or low CO2 concrete. This is an important component for achieving climate neutrality. But if carbon emissions cannot be avoided in any other way, and this is actually the case of 2/3 of emissions in the cement production, it's a chemical process. The only solution is carbon capture and closing the carbon cycles as far as possible by using carbon in ideally long life products. So we are talking about CCU. And as no large-scale CCU solutions are currently existing, we also have to phase and to invest in carbon capture and geological storage as well, so CCS, which entails the construction of an entire CO2 transport infrastructures. So both areas, CCS and CCU, require immense technological investment, innovation, and there's no out-of-the-shelf solution, even large scale. But we are full of energy to go this way. And currently, a lot of CCU and CCS projects are running as joint efforts, company by company.
Thank you very much, Ms. Decker, and thank you so much for your patience with our technological hiccups here. Mr. SEEBACH, I'll address the same question to you. Is the current rate of ambition and technological innovation in your industry sufficient to achieve net zero industry emissions by 2050?
Yeah, we're taking this challenge very seriously, and I guess the level of ambition is pretty high. So we as BASF have significantly ramped up our efforts in reducing emissions over the last couple of years. Actually, we have cut our emissions in half since 1990, while we doubled our sales outcome already. But we realize now what is behind us was somewhat easier to achieve than what is ahead of us. So we are now facing a new phase of technological and economical challenges when it comes to emission-free technologies. We need, in many ways, new downstream technologies. We need to electrify processes with renewable energy that we haven't electrified in the past. So the low-hanging fruits are pretty much done. We need to tackle this problem, and we're doing this with significant resources, money, people, and ideas to address that issue. And maybe one more thing is that the critical point is renewable electricity here. So technologically, and just to get it right, technologically, we know how to avoid pretty much every single ton of carbon in the chemical industry, technologically. Are these technologies economically feasible? Are they fully acceptable in many ways? There are some open questions. We are quite optimistic that we can tackle most of them. But we know what the road, what the trajectory is, and we have now to further work on that, and we are quite optimistic that we will succeed in the end. And maybe one last sentence: cutting emissions further is an essential license to operate question for the chemical industry. We do believe that there is no other way around that. And if we want to get a license to operate, especially in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, we need to cut emissions even further, and we are working on that.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Seebach. I'd like to go right to our second question, where we'll take a look at greenhouse gases. In light of the continuously rising GHG emissions, how can energy companies, especially those engaged in fossil fuel energy production, do more to be part of the solution and do less to be part of the problem? Let's start with Markus RAURAMO.
CO2 reductions actually in the last decade were mostly achieved by the energy sector. And that was achieved by reducing coal-fired production and the massive increase in renewables. Now, today it's clear that any energy company has to have a clear decarbonization path. And in Fortum, we are targeting carbon neutrality in our European operations by 2035 and cutting our emissions in half by 2030, so well ahead of EU targets. We have a clear coal exit path for the remaining coal assets. We're exiting coal in our district heating in Espoo already in 2025, exiting coal in the UK 2025, in Netherlands by the end of 2029, and 80% of our German coal-fired production will be exited by 2025. But I see actually more opportunity than a challenge in this area. The sites are exactly in the right places to provide balancing power, storage, flexibility with new forms of energy generation, and for example, hydrogen. And this is a good segue to actually comment that we focus now a lot on also technologies to clean other sectors like heating, industry, and transport. We can do that with clean gases, for example, hydrogen, ammonia, and electrification, for example, of transport. One example of this type of activity is a potential 500 megawatt electrolyzer project that we are contemplating at the Maasvlakte site in Rotterdam that could provide 3 terawatt hours of clean hydrogen and reduce, if used, for example, for steel, 4 million tons of CO2. In addition to this, we are developing solar and onshore wind, 1.5 to 2 gigawatts of new capacity in Europe by 2025. In Russia, we have a 2 gigawatt renewable pipeline. And then of course, solutions for decarbonizing and circular economy solutions for industries and infrastructure. For example, waste to energy, plastic recycling, battery recycling. So the answer is we can do a lot, and we are doing a lot.
Thank you very much. I'd like to address the same question to Felipe BAYÓN. How can your company be more of the solution and less of the problem when it comes to GHG emissions?
Good evening and good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. And I think the companies that are in the oil and gas industry are very well placed in terms of providing the technology, providing the resources and the know-how to ensure that we can all advance in this matter. And one reflection that I normally make or constantly make is that one CO2 ton is the same regardless of where it's emitted in the world. We're all in the same boat in this one, but it does matter where we actually invest the resources. And in that sense, from Ecopetrol, there's a few things that I can mention. We're doing one, we're becoming a gassier company. We're producing more and more gas. Roughly 80% of Colombians use gas today, every day, but there's still 1.5 million families that use coal and wood to cook on a daily basis. So we need to advance in that sense. And as Markus was mentioning, a couple things we're doing. We're looking at a small electrolyzer in our research facility this year. We're actually focused on energy intensity, energy emissions, and reducing our footprint, not just CO2 footprint, but also the water footprint, and it has to do with our circular economy. We're looking at things like nature-based solutions, and by 2030, Colombia has pledged to reduce 51% of its CO2 emissions. So we're gonna be announcing this year our goal by 2030 and 2050. We are working on a different goal, but now the bar's been raised. And in that sense, by 2030, we want to have 50, that's 50 eco reserves, that's forest reserves. So we're looking at nature-based solutions as well. So I do believe that the industry, oil and gas, which has been fundamental for countries like Colombia, and that we need to protect at its core to ensure that we do an orderly transition whilst we bring our resources, technology, and know-how to ensure that we can reach the goal that we are all aiming for.
Thank you very much, Mr. BAYÓN. Our last question in this first round is for Thiago BARRAL. Welcome back. It's happy to see your face again. My question to you is, how can industry leaders be a little bit more proactive in driving technological innovation and the systemic shift to a green economy in their respective sectors? Mr. BARRAL?
Well, thank you, Jennifer. I'm really glad to be at BETD now for the third time. Well, speaking from an energy planning perspective, industrial assets have typically long lifespan, and we are talking about investments that will be around for many years, sometimes decades. And because of this, we realize that any successful approach towards greening the industry will need to combine, on one hand, incremental innovation, and on the other hand, radical innovation. Incremental innovation, they can be pretty relevant for reducing carbon footprint of the existing assets during their remaining lifespan. And in addition to that, it will increase efficiency and as a result, competitiveness. They are not so costly, they have a shorter payback period, so they are more easily implemented and will help us better manage our carbon budget while we develop and deploy radical innovation. So just to give one example, the digital transformation of industrial processes will certainly untap a great number of incremental innovations. But of course, incremental innovation alone will not lead us to systemic shift that we need. So radical innovation then will need to be deployed with when new industrial plants, when new industrial facilities are designed and built. And this will only likely to happen once these innovations are proven, at least on a demonstration scale. So if we want industry leaders to be more proactive, we better work to disseminate and reduce asymmetry of information about best practices, available technologies, and R&D projects regarding each industrial process, reducing transaction costs towards decarbonization. We better work to disseminate and the adoption of information systems and digitalization of the various industrial processes and sectors. We better work to facilitate access to finance and off-balance resources for innovation investment. And last but not least, be sure to remove as fast as possible any regulatory barriers that may arise in the pathway.
Thank you very much, Mr. BARRAL. Thank you all for your opening statements. I'd like now to take a moment and go to our Mentimeter results. As a reminder, the question was, the level of environmental regulation currently in place for industry sectors such as oil and gas, construction, and chemical production is, and it looks like most of us have said, far too low. We need more for far-reaching government control and oversight. Somewhat too low. We're looking at right around 90% of people saying, 80% of people saying somewhat too low or far too low. Thank you, everyone, for participating in that poll. I'd like to go now for round 2 with our panelists. The current regulatory framework and the role of policymakers. Again, in this round, we'll ask our speakers to keep their replies to around 2 minutes. Our first question is for 3 of you, for Mr. SEEBACH, Ms. Decker, and Mr. BAYÓN. What can policymakers do to better support your industry in transitioning to cleaner technologies and production processes? Why don't we start with Mr. SEEBACH?
Well, as I said in my first statement, so the key to BASF's transition towards climate neutrality is renewable energies and renewable electricity in particular. So the main priority for policymakers around the world should be abolish any potential barrier, roadblock, or hurdles on renewable energies, right? That may be taxes, that may be levies, that may be surcharges that make renewable energy more expensive than it has to be. That may be infrastructure bottlenecks. That may be slow permitting processes for renewable energy infrastructure. We in BASF, we believe that it takes both. It takes, on the one hand, own renewable electricity generation in the chemical industry, and it needs a procurement strategy from the market off the grid. So both pillars have a strong regulatory angle, and we can only encourage policymakers to address that issue. And one more thing, downstream, we are facing significant economic gaps of new technologies towards state-of-the-art technologies. For the time being, we believe we need an appropriate funding framework to bridge that gap. Not forever, right? Not for decades, but to ramp it up, to start deploying these technologies, funding needs to be considered. And for example, in Europe, there's a strong framework given by the European Union for state aid and things like that. We strongly believe that all of it needs to be reconsidered in the context of that transition challenge we are facing.
Thank you very much, Mr. SEEBACH. Ms. Decker, the same question to you.
Thank you. We need a reliable policy framework, and I mentioned earlier CCS and CCU, the cement industry and CEMEX. We need investment programs and governmental support. And I absolutely agree with Mr. SEEBACH. We need the implementation of green energy, of renewable energy. We need more capacity and the availability of renewable energy. I cannot say it enough. And the further development of political instruments to secure the gap between CO2 price and respective CO2 abatement costs. As an example, the widespread introduction of carbon contracts for difference. Whatever those contracts are looking like in detail, but we need them. And those programs will enable the commercial scaling up and commissioning of new technologies. On a supranational level, we need at first European-wide, but also on the long-term worldwide CO2 emission-driven trading systems to continue and to improve Today, this is the EU ETS for Europe, which works quite well from our perspective. Will soon enter into a carbon border adjustment tax at EU level to protect the industry from carbon leakage. And carbon leakage is a real danger for the industry. So we need those instruments. But we should also not forget the power of the market. The demand for climate neutral, that's what we currently see. The demand for climate neutral product is currently not sufficient to make those large scale investments in the climate neutral production. So, for example, what we need from the policy sustainable public procurement as a role model, or financial incentives, or adaptation of regulations. So what we need is foremost reliable political framework.
Thank you very much, Ms. Decker. I'd like to address the same question now to Mr. BAYÓN.
Well, I think the Colombian example has been a very good one. In what sense? Over the last 2.5 years, Colombia has gone from basically no renewable energy to commitments of 2,500 megawatts today. In our case, Ecopetrol, we're the largest self-generating company in Colombia. And we've already started constructing our solar farms, and we're already measuring winds in many parts of the country. And please bear in mind that Colombia is, in that sense, is very blessed in terms of solar power, or ability for solar power, and wind capacity. So we're going to go from basically none or zero to 400 megawatts of solar and wind by 2023. And we're aiming at least 1 gigawatt in that sense. So I think regulation is already in place, and it's clarity around the framework that companies can use and investors can use. And in terms of the incentives that have been mentioned by my colleagues already by government. The second thing, and that's to do with renewables. The second thing is around hydrogen. And with the help of the German government, Colombia is building its hydrogen pathway, and following examples that have been successful, like Chile, for example. And we're working in that sense. And I was mentioning the electrolyzer that we're bringing later this year into the country. Around nature-based solutions, there's clarity around some of the usages that we can do in Colombia, and I think Colombia is very well placed. And the last thing I will mention is that in Ecopetrol, we have actually made a non-binding offer for ISA, which is one of the largest energy transmission companies in the region. So that, in that sense, just moving from pure oil and gas, protecting oil and gas, but expanding into other areas that are actually allowable or allowed by regulation is a good sign. And just thinking about the companies that we need to be in the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Thank you very much. I've got another question for our two panelists, Mr. BARRAL and Mr. RAURAMO. How can environmental regulation of industries be coordinated more effectively on an international or on a multilateral level? Let's go ahead and start with Mr. BARRAL.
Okay, well, Jennifer, I would start by saying that finance plays a central role here. If money owners set their lending policies based on certain environmental regulation standards, this will certainly have an impact, a positive impact. This, combined with a strong capacity building all across the industry, regulators, policymakers, particularly in emerging economies, that can help the world avoid either carbon leakage when you have migration of industries to regions with less stringent environmental regulations, but also avoid developed countries closing their markets for industrial imports based on environmental claims. In addition to that, I'd like to mention also the importance of a few issues. First, disseminating information about the state of the art in terms of environmental regulation. It's really important. And for sure, this can be accelerated by means of technical cooperation between countries on a multilateral arena. Also, developing regulation that is based on comprehensive criteria regarding carbon emissions, instead of picking technology-specific end-of-pipe solutions or regulations that end up causing technology lock-in, and that at the end may be too costly or delay adoption of radical innovations. I would like to mention the positive impact of announcing regulation with progressive steps with a medium and long-term perspective. That can also set the pace and help mobilize more people, more businesses, and more governments, as well as providing stronger incentive for R&D and innovation to be developed. And finally, if I may still add, carbon border adjustment, if fairly designed and comprehensive enough, I would say it can also help promote international coordination for greening the industry.
Thank you very much, Mr. BARRAL. I'll address the same question to Mr. RAURAMO now.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'll pick up on a couple of points actually that the fellow panelists, Felipe and Alexandra, raised. So Felipe said that this is a global issue, and indeed climate change is a global issue. And then Alexandra's point that we will need huge amounts of renewables, and then policies and regulation play a huge role. So climate change doesn't stop at national borders. That is clear, and that's why we do need a global approach and global coordination to fight it. Also, ambition level is important, and the European Green Deal, which is designed to mobilize 1 trillion euros of sustainable investments, is a very good start. A lot of coordination is needed because the markets will become more and more interdependent and complex. Also, electricity and gas, which from our point of view are two key businesses, they will become more and more interconnected. So on the point about the huge need of renewables needed, I'll take Europe as an example. Areas which need it, for example, Germany to clean up both the electricity and gases. Now Germany is producing about 45% of the electricity and 18% of total energy by renewables. So much more is needed, but there will not be enough land. There will not be locations or zoning possible to do that. In Europe, however, there are areas like the Nordics, which have potential for hundreds of terawatt hours of renewables electricity production. So we need a holistic approach to make sure that energy flows, whether it's electricity or gases, they flow from the places where they can be produced to the places where they will be consumed. So we need a holistic regulatory approach, both European and then cross-continental. Same applies for green hydrogen. Many of fellow panelists mentioned actually hydrogen, and ideally we would have as global and as transparent markets as possible to make sure that when someone is producing, let's say if we produce clean hydrogen in Finland, that would be regarded clean in Europe, that would be regarded clean in Brazil and clean in Colombia, and vice versa. Then we'll have efficient allocation of capital and resources. A successful example of this is carbon pricing in the sectors where ETS has been applied in Europe. But what we would need to see going forward, really to fight climate change, is that ETS would be further tightened, it would be broadened to other sectors, and eventually we would have ideally global carbon pricing. That would then mean that we wouldn't have to, for example, have carbon border taxing to avoid carbon leakage. So unified carbon pricing across the sectors, sector coupling. And sector coupling, I think, is the last point I wanted to mention here. So to achieve our climate targets, both the cleaning of electricity and cleaning of gases, it will be really, really essential that we have a regulation that enables all the required amount of renewables to come to market, and then to connect that to the flexibility and storage possibility of clean gas. But vital and very important for us, so we are definitely supporting cross-national and cross-continental policies and regulation and target setting.
Thank you so very much, Mr. RAURAMO. Thank you to all 5 of our panelists for this engaging discussion. We talked about carbon pricing, making it united. We talked about more capacity for renewable energy. We talked a little bit about green hydrogen. We talked about how finance is key, and that perhaps most importantly, climate change doesn't stop at borders.